So I am about to introduce our speaker for tonight, but just to let you know, at the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity to ask our speaker questions. And we are asking you to submit those questions through the chat function during the talk. And I will then try and collate the submitted questions and put them to Dr. Dhawan on your behalf. Right, that's all the housekeeping information. So I'm now delighted to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Suhail Dhawan. Dr. Suhail Dhawan is a fellow with us. He was awarded a very prestigious Isaac Newton Trust Kavli Fellowship in October 2020, and has only just managed to get to the college to actually in person be a fellow with the college, because we offered to house him during his fellowship. Dr. Dhawan completed his undergraduate studies at Delhi University and a master's at UCL. His PhD was at the European Southern Observatory in Garching by Munchen, and his degree is from the Technical University in Munich. Before joining the Institute of Astronomy here in Cambridge, Dr. Dhawan has also been a postdoc at the Oskar Klein Center in Stockholm. And apart from doing astronomical surveys and cosmology, Dr. Dhawan is really passionate about animal welfare activism, trying out stand-up comedy, and roasting artisanal coffee. And he's just told me he's found a place where they have the best coffee that he's ever tasted, just in Cambridge, right about. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Dhawan, for a talk that starts a title as Candles in the Sky. It's all yours.
Cool. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks everyone for calling in to hear me talk about some of the interesting work in astronomy that's going on around supernovae, their use in cosmology to understand the composition and the expansion of the universe. So this will broadly be a motivation for why supernovae and other astronomical transient phenomena, so those where the brightness changes with time, are being interesting today for understanding physical phenomena, but also to understand the universe as a whole. I'll be talking about things that I am currently working on, things I have worked on, and where to go from here. What is it that I am excited about, and sort of what are the ways in which we aim to answer questions. I've dropped my email and my CRS ID out here. So if there are any undergraduate or Part 3 students who are looking for research experience or just to talk about certain aspects of anything I have spoken about, because I'll just broadly cover things that I'm interested in and or want to do some projects, very happy to chat. So please feel free to drop an email. Also, if you're not an undergraduate student or a master's student, but just want to have a chat about something and you found something interesting, very happy to talk about it offline as well. So over the next around 45 to 50 minutes, I'll start by talking about what are supernovae, giving a context for why they are exciting. So there's these three thumbnails for the three parts. This thumbnail is basically an image of the remnant of the first ever extragalactic supernova. So the first ever supernova that was seen outside our galaxy in our neighbor S Andromedae. It is known as supernova 1885A. The nomenclature is pretty straightforward, the year and then just going through the alphabet. So it's the first one in 1885. And it's sort of where the idea of what a supernova, as in a very bright new star, might be, because as in astronomy in general, the better we understand distances to certain galaxies, the better we are able to also understand other physical phenomena with respect to objects in those galaxies. So that's the first part of what I'll be talking about broadly as to motivating why supernovae and other astrophysical transients that we have been looking into recently are very exciting. So putting that into sort of the context of cosmology, the second part would be, why are we very sort of excited about the expansion rate of the universe? So this thumbnail, it's typically seen in a lot of cosmology talks that are centered on the expansion rate, which is basically looking at the expansion history of the universe from its origin all the way to present day. And this was sort of an image that was released as part of a press release from a big satellite mission, which aimed to observe the first radiation that can be seen in the universe, so the relic radiation of the Big Bang, which is known as the cosmic microwave background. And it had a very sort of precise mapping of the temperature of this background radiation. And it's extremely important currently in the debate about the expansion rate of the universe. The third thumbnail, which is arguably less intellectual because it's just the first photograph I could find of a magnifying glass, is sort of something I'll be talking about towards the latter part of my talk, where I'll be talking about the phenomenon of gravitational lensing, and it magnifies the light from this source that is being lensed. And in this particular case, talking about why the lensing of supernovae is particularly interesting in cosmology, and why it is that that's something I'm interested in working in currently as well. So getting straight to it, what are supernovae? Why are we interested in them? So these are bright explosions of stars. They happen through sort of various physical processes, where they produce heavy elements in the universe. So for example, supernovae that were in our own galaxy produce the heavy elements that we see on our planet. And that's sort of what led to the idea and the phrasing that we're all stardust, because that's where we get like heavy elements like calcium and iron and aluminium from. And we typically sort of expect that there's going to be one supernova per galaxy per century on average. And the last one in our galaxy was about 400 years ago, and that was seen by the naked eye by the Austrian astronomer Johannes Kepler, and it's still studied as a remnant of the supernova in order to sort of study the properties really well, because it's so close by that we could still see the remnant with modern telescopes. The image here is that of one of the closest supernovae of type 1a, and the type 1a, which I will sort of briefly define in my talk, is so the one of the very important probes in cosmology today. This supernova itself, which is in the nearby Pinwheel galaxy, is in itself also very important, because it was found very, very close to its explosion time, which has only really been possible in the modern era of astronomical surveys, and has given us new insights as well as very important experimental confirmations of theories of what leads to these supernovae. But it's also important from the cosmological standpoint, because variable stars in this galaxy have also been used to get an independent, accurate distance. This is something I'll talk about when talking about the expansion rate. So these are some of the gold standard supernovae, which I've put out here as some observations just to go through to explain some part of what the explosion scenario is like. So since I work on type 1As and I'll be talking about cosmology, I've put up sort of what is a typical dispersed light observation of a type 1e supernova. So as I said, the heavy elements are produced in the ejected material from such explosions. So here you see, if you just split the light with a spectroscopic instrument on your telescope, you see that at early times, there's all these heavy elements that can be seen in the ejected material. The longer you sort of observe these, and supernovae like 2011 FE have been such a sort of gold standard or a template, that they have even been able to be observed till 1,000 days after explosion. You can then start to see what is the central engine that is powering these supernovae, and that is a core of elements that are from the same group as iron. So it's the most stable nuclei that we have. And radioactive decay of these elements is what ends up powering the light from these supernovae. So that's what you see is leading to this increase. And as the supernova starts fading away, you start seeing this decline. In some of the rarer wavelengths, this was something that I worked on for my thesis, so that's why I wanted to put this plot up, even though it was a bit of a clustered plot. In some rarer wavelengths, we start to see that they rebrighten, which is a way in which we can get to know how ionized the ejected material is, and sort of what insights do we have on certain parts of the explosion, like how metallic is the explosion, or how much radioactive material is actually produced. The reason why 2011 FE is important is because not only was it close, there was very little obscuration of the supernova from the host galaxy material around it. And that's something that's really important, because when studying the supernovae and trying to understand their brightness and their color, it is extremely important to understand what comes from the supernova itself and what from the surroundings. And therefore, having something that is so well observed and so sort of well measured in time, that is not obscured by the dust, gives you a sort of clean template upon which we can base other inference of dust properties with other supernovae. So this is sort of a compilation of the data for another nearby supernova that was even closer, like twice as close as 2011 FE, but it was very heavily obscured by the material in the galaxy. And understanding the properties, like the sizes and the composition of that, could have been done really well because we could compare it to these lines that are from 11 FE itself. I particularly also had a bit of a partial view of why I wanted to put 11 FE straight up there. And that was because I was an undergraduate student when this supernova went off, and I think it was on the 24th of August. And it's very rare that like you can remember the day, because these supernovae like typically don't have that well a constrained uncertainty. But because this was seen around 9 hours after explosion, we knew what day it was. And while I wasn't working directly on supernovae at the time, I was very excited about this. And I was talking to certain friends of mine at the time at university, none of whom were physicists or astronomers. And I was like, oh my God, there's a very nearby supernova. And it was it always had a very sort of Hollywoodized apocalyptic view, because everyone else was just like, how nearby are we talking? And I was like, no. And then everyone went like, oh, right, so it's got to be light years away. And I was like, yes, it is light years away. And they're like, but how many? Like 10? And I was like, no, more like 20 million. And there was just silence for about 30 seconds. And I have never literally seen someone become speechless because of the vastness of the universe. I always thought that was a metaphor. But I guess thanks to 11 FE, it was the first time I got to see it literally like as an event or an incident, which is something that was both a little puzzling, but also like a really sweet moment for me to remember and look back at almost 10 years later. So that's why sort of, apart from the fact that I've used 11 FE data a lot in my work, that was an incident that always sort of made 11 FE slightly special for me. So moving from anecdotes of like around nearby modern supernovae, just a brief origin for people like who might be interested in the history of the use of supernovae, both in astrophysics and cosmology. So while this was a term that was coined in the late 20s by Bader and Zwicky, and this is who it is attributed to, there are earlier papers by Swedish astronomer Knut Lundmark, and this gave me a lot of brownie points in Stockholm because he's quite a legend there. So talking about supernovae potentially being like coined as a term by Lundmark was a great sort of conversation topic for after conferences. But these were sort of just bright new stars. And Fritz Zwicky was one of the most prolific discoverers and observers of supernovae of all kinds, not just type 1a, but like the type 2s, and also sort of subclasses within that. A very nice history of the use of supernovae as distance indicators, which is also an idea that Zwicky had proposed because he said they were very bright and we should be able to see them at large distances. Is in a very nice review by Bruno Leibengut in 2017, and I'm biased because that was my PhD advisor, and we had lots of discussions on like historical Hubble diagrams with type 1a supernovae from the 60s. But it's a great review for anyone who's interested in looking more into the history of supernovae, where the term comes from, and also how they have been used as distance indicators. So supernovae come in sort of various types, and I've mentioned type 1a supernovae, but there's also like lots of different other types and subtypes. So a typical way of classifying them is through observations. So when you look at the dispersed light or the spectrum, the type 1As, which are in a sort of different background, is because they are from a different physical mechanism. So it is instabilities in a white dwarf, which is a very compact star, which has a companion in a binary orbit. And that's what the instability is, what then leads to the explosion. And that's typically what we see if we observe this supernova sort of shortly, like it could be between hours to a couple of weeks from its date of explosion. This is a different physical mechanism from supernovae that are of type 2, which have a collapse of the core of a star that's burning fuel. And they lead to compact object remnants. And there are different sort of subclasses within the type 2s as well. But this is a sort of presence of hydrogen in this dispersed light is a very sort of clear way of classifying them. Another sort of, ones that are type 1, because they do not show hydrogen, but they are also sort of from the collapse of a core, but the envelope around this is stripped off, are these type 1b and type 1c supernovae. There have also been sort of subclasses within them that can be physically different based on like their properties of the spectrum and the brightness evolution. And these are sort of broadly put together as the class of core collapse supernovae. And depending on what you're specifically working on, you either call them stripped envelope or just like call them type 2, where all of them are co-collapse supernovae. The reason for sort of bringing up type 2s as well is because they have also been used historically as distance indicators. So it's not just type 1a that are important for cosmology, but because type 1a are quite a lot brighter, so in some cases even 10 times brighter than type 2 supernovae, they are seen at a lot farther distance, and therefore they are the ones that are used most typically. However, there is a lot of effort recently to use a particular kind of type 2 supernova, which has a very flat brightness evolution at a certain point in its lifetime. And they have been used as well in cosmology, and they are sort of being pushed as being an alternate to type 1a. So it's always nice to have like two different or multiple different probes of the same cosmological quantities, so that you can have a very important cross-check. So type 2s in that sense are interesting as physical systems, but also in cosmology. So what I'll be talking about today is specifically in the supernova regime type 1a supernovae, and also talking about these mergers of compact objects. So these neutron star mergers, but also like events like neutron star black hole mergers. These are all compact objects at the end of the lifetime of a star. And neutron star mergers emit gravitational waves, which are ripples in the fabric of space-time itself. And these are extremely important to measure accurate distances, because if we can model what the wave looks like, that depends on the distance to the object. And these are sort of sirens, because the waves themselves are like the sounds of space. So there's a lot of really cool terminology, I have to admit, which I mean sounds to me a lot more like Kurt Vonnegut novels, but I really like the phrase standard sirens, which was proposed like maybe a couple of decades ago. And these are sort of the counterparts to standard candles, because instead of the light, we're using the gravitational wave or the sound part in order to measure the distance, which is important to measure the cosmology. I was hoping sort of like maybe this is or this isn't, but I like this phrase, the term standard-ish candles, because type 1a supernovae are not standard candles, like they're not all of the same brightness. But if we do sort of apply certain relations that have been seen in nature between their brightness and other properties, they can be sort of calibrated so that we can use them in cosmology. Now that's led to this phrase, standardizable candles, which not a lot of people like because some dictionaries don't have that. But I'm hoping maybe standard-ish candles is something that is a better phrase to describe type 1a supernovae. It might not be. But type 1a supernovae are explosions of a compact star in a binary system, as I mentioned. The thing is that while the nature of the binary system itself is something that is not very well understood, the fact that the white dwarf is the one that produces the radioactive elements is something that allows us to sort of understand where these relationships between their brightness and their sort of properties, like the shape of their brightness evolution or their color or what environment they end up exploding in, is something that can be used in order to precisely measure quantities in cosmology. So before talking about the type 1a supernovae, what is it that sort of is interesting about these new events that we have recently been able to access with observations? So this is the sort of what I think of, and what is I have also heard in a lot of ways of explaining these mergers of neutron stars, is that it's a light and sound show of space. The gravitational waves that are emitted from this merger of two neutron stars were a prediction from Einstein's theory of gravity and are a very accurate way of measuring the distance to these events. So therefore are very sort of sensitive to how fast the universe is expanding. But what we also need, and this is something I'll explain a bit more in the following slide, is to have a detection of where these were exploded, or like what galaxy led to this explosion. And this is something that happened for the first time in 2017. And that is where, so this sort of lots of stuff going on in this plot is basically, we had the sound from LIGO, which is the Gravitational Wave Observatory, so LIGO-Virgo collaboration. So this is 3 detectors across sort of US and Europe, and in order to sort of get a longer baseline so that we can have a better understanding of where this event is, so we can go and find something that is emitting light at the same space where you are getting the gravitational wave from. And while events that are called dark standard sirens, which are binary black hole mergers because they don't emit any light, have been routinely discovered since 2015, when the first such event was discovered on September 14th. Binary neutron stars have been seen, but there is only one such event where we've seen both the gravitational waves and the light from the same place. And that's something that is extremely important for cosmology. So the reason why it's important is that we have, so when Edwin Hubble sort of proposed the idea that the universe was expanding from his observations of redshifts and distances to galaxies, the Hubble law that was proposed was quite sort of straightforward, as seen in this equation. What we want to measure is h, what we need is v and d. And essentially what we have is a lot of distances and not that many velocities. And the reason is that the distance we get from the gravitational waveform of binary black holes, and what we do need is the recession velocity of the galaxy. And what that requires is for us to basically pinpoint a galaxy. So while we can't see in the electromagnetic the binary black holes, we can see in the electromagnetic region the binary neutron stars. The reason why this was the only event so far was that while LIGO, the Gravitational Wave Observatory, was operating, this being a very nearby event, the sort of alert that was given by LIGO and Virgo was something that was giving you also a region of the sky where you expect this event to be. And because it's really nearby, we had they had really good data. So the region of the sky was quite small. So pointing your regular optical, near-infrared, ultraviolet, gamma ray, this entire electromagnetic spectrum towards that area with sort of certain telescopes, it was very easy to put a precision on what the position of this event is. And that's sort of what this image is showing here. This is where you see the image like between half to 1.5 days after the merger of the two neutron stars. And there you see that it has already disappeared because it's now already too faint to be observed by that particular telescope. This is the one at the observatory in Chile. And so given the difficulty, there's only really been one event, and the ones that sort of have been discovered in gravitational waves, the region of the sky where they have been sort of localized to is quite wide. So while there have been lots of very amazing efforts to try and figure out where this light source is, not any of them have like an undisputed detection of that light source. So what we really have is just like one event. So that's where we have as a shortcoming, that we need more such events. A reason to measure the Hubble constant, or sort of this expansion rate of the universe very precisely. So what I did, and this was like, there have been lots of papers, probably 1,000 papers or maybe more since 2017 on this particular object, because it's been studied really well, and it's sort of also a way in which we can help to learn how we can optimize future resources. Was that I took, so this is just an artist's illustration of the transient associated with it. This is known as a kilonova, and it's sort of a transient that produces very heavy elements in the universe. And the optical and the electromagnetic display in general from such a transient is something that allows us to pinpoint where it is in the universe and what galaxy it is. And that gives us the recession velocity from taking a spectrum of that galaxy. However, what we did was use the light to an even greater degree, wherein taking all the colors that it had from the ultraviolet to the infrared, we used three-dimensional models that were made by a colleague of mine in Stockholm, and we combined the information on the inclination of this kilonova from these models with the information from the distance in the gravitational waves. And this is because in the gravitational waves, the distance is very strongly correlated with the inclination of the system. And as a result, what we see is that the uncertainty on that distance is quite high. What we saw was if you combine both those things, we can start to improve these uncertainties quite a bit, such that we only need half as many events to be able to measure the expansion rate really precisely. So the current thing that we're doing is not only improving the models, so to try and understand how opaque this ejected material is to different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum, but also to then start to understand from this how well can we constrain this for future events. And this is something I am currently working on in a collaboration, which is trying to build a new instrument for a 10-meter class telescope in La Palma at the Gran Tecan. And this is something that's going to be very, very important when it comes to understanding how we need to position our observations in time in order to get a very strong constraint on the inclination. So why are we so excited? I've been talking about the expansion rate so much. And the reason why we're very excited about it right now is because when we take the fossilized light from the early universe, and we have a very well-tested standard model for the universe. So it has around 70% of dark energy, which is a sort of anti-gravity vacuum energy, which pushes things away at an accelerated rate, and around sort of 25% dark matter, and close to 5% normal matter. Now, this is what we call a standard lambda CDM model. And it's been really well tested both in the early universe as well as like to explain how like what the structure of the large scale in the late universe is, and lots of other observations both in the early and the late universe. Now, what we see right now is that there's this distance ladder, and I'll talk about that quite soon. And that gives us a direct measurement of how fast the universe is expanding. Now, one part of that ladder, one rung, is supernovae, which are very crucial in order for us to be able to make this measurement with small uncertainties. And we see that there's this tension. So the Hubble tension is something that has been sort of a very exciting topic or a very hot debate in the last few years in astronomy and cosmology. And what we are not fully sure of is there something that we do not understand in the measurements or the way we interpret the measurements? Or do we have something new to learn about how we describe the universe? Is there something new needed to sort of explain all the observations, and the current standard cosmological model is not enough? So that's why we need standard sirens, because they are completely different from supernovae, and they give you this sort of one-shot estimate of the expansion rate. So that's just the V equals HD. We get a V, we get a D. Now, that's something that is very difficult. As I just mentioned, there's only one such event. It's really difficult to find such events. So while that is also happening, and we're trying to improve on those constraints, we also sort of try to improve on and understand how this distance ladder works. So why do we want to use type 1e supernovae? What is so exciting about this? This is a nice artist's rendition of different possible scenarios of type 1e supernovae. You can see that, like, sort of there's an artist's rendition of the white dwarf that either accretes material, so it just has material falling on it from a companion star, or it collides and merges with another white dwarf. But there are also like other possible scenarios which lead to the type 1e supernova explosion. But as I had mentioned, it is where all the ion group elements, so elements like nickel, which radioactively decays, is produced inside this explosion of the white dwarf. So what this does is this makes this or as a result, the supernova is extremely bright. So some of them outshine the galaxies that they are in. And because of the fact they are this bright, and they all sort of produce a similar optical or rather electromagnetic display, they can then, using that display, be used as very accurate measurements of distance. They're also found in all galaxy types, so we can use them to study the galaxies as well. And also that we can use them and improve their sort of precision in cosmology using properties of the galaxy. So because they're bright, they're kind of quite similar. This was like ideas that have been circulating for a very long time to use type 1e supernovae for cosmology. So when type 1e supernovae in the sort of earlier universe were used to measure how the universe has been evolving, it was seen that while people expected that, well, the galaxies and like the gravitational attraction between them would slow the things down, it was a big surprise that what was actually happening was that the expansion of the universe is actually accelerating. And while that has been measured quite precisely, it's been measured by supernovae that have sort of been improved in our understanding of those supernovae, but also in terms of the number that we have and how far ago in the universe we have seen them. We don't still like fully understand the physical origin of what is causing this. So it could be something that is like a vacuum energy that's pushing things away at an accelerated rate. It could be that the standard understanding of gravity from Einstein's theory is incomplete and we need some modifications to it. Or it could be that it is some sort of field that is changing its behavior as a function of cosmic time. Now, one way to look at this is taking sort of data from the early universe, as well as taking large data sets of supernovae of type 1a, but also in the future, supernovae of type 2, and combining them together using sort of some Bayesian statistics model. That's something I've been looking at, and that's essentially just like taking lots of different explanations for what could be causing accelerated expansion and applying an Occam's razor. So basically saying that if you have a more complicated explanation for your observations, does it actually do a much better job at explaining them? And that's something that I've been working on. I have worked on with like previous compilations of supernovae. So this is using like data from the Supernova Legacy Survey, which was a really long survey that was running on the Canada, France, Hawaii telescope. But I'm also using like Hubble Space Telescope data, and is something that I'll be working towards with ongoing and future surveys, like potentially addition of the Pan-STARRS survey as well as the dark energy survey. So this is something that I'm quite interested in. And while currently we have been able to exclude certain simplified possibilities for, say, modifications to the standard gravity scenario, there are lots of still potential models that are very viable, and future satellite missions as well as future ground-based missions would be extremely important in order to rule those out. So getting from like supernovae that are like in the slightly older or like slightly more distant universe to something that's a bit closer is this distance ladder that measures the current expansion of the universe. So this is done through it's a very elegant idea where you essentially just use distances to a particular star from an independent source, and then build this ladder up. So the way this is done is the supernovae are at the most distant rung of the ladder, and the reason for that is that we need something that is bright enough that where we are essentially probing the expansion of the universe and not probing a velocity of the galaxy that is coming because of pulls and pushes from other galaxies or other clusters of galaxies in the universe. That would happen if to the supernovae here. So what we do here is that we end up, or like what has been done in, is that using other variable stars, like the Cepheid variables, which were something that were proposed as being indicators of distances in the early 20th century, have been used to get distances to galaxies that have type 1a supernovae. And like the galaxy that I showed you earlier, the pinwheel galaxy, there is a sample of such galaxies, around 20 galaxies, which have distances measured through this method. Furthermore, like there has been a calibration of this Cepheid luminosity as well, through even sort of more close to our galaxy methods, which is something that I have been working on currently with a group at UCL, where we're trying to look at a more advanced statistical model in order to try and distinguish what properties of these stars are coming from intrinsic differences and what is coming from extrinsic differences that are saved from properties of the host galaxy. This is something I've been recently interested in. And I had mainly been working on the part of the type 1a supernovae that is in the highest rung or the third rung of this distance ladder. So the reason why that's important is what we wanted to see is this measurement that we see is discrepant, as I'd shown you that this is a lot higher than the measurement from the early universe, from the cosmic microwave background. It is very precise, or like the reported uncertainties are quite small. And what we wanted to see was, all right, if we do take the supernovae, but instead of looking at them in visible light, we look at them in the infrared light, do we get the same answer? And this was a paper that we did like sort of model independent approach to looking at the brightness evolution of these supernovae. And we looked at them in the infrared because in the infrared, as you see, so while the dust occludes stuff in the optical, so this the top is the optical. This is an image of from the European Southern Observatory of observations in different wave bands. This is in the visible region, and this is in the near infrared. You can see that what is obscured in the optical is something that is actually you can see through in the near infrared. And that makes it very important as a cross-check for whether or not like that is something that is causing this discrepancy. Like, are we just seeing something where these supernovae are more obscured by the dust? That's what's giving us a different value. What we found was that there's a very good agreement between what we see in the infrared and what has been seen in the optical. And that's something that I did in a paper a few years ago. And this is a sort of very primitive version of the Hubble diagram, which is the relation between the recession velocity of the galaxy and the observed magnitude of the supernova. And using this and the absolute luminosity of the supernovae, we were then able to measure the expansion rate with a small sample of supernovae. But we got a really good agreement with what was seen in the optical. What has also been done, this is a project that has recently been concluded by a summer student at the Institute of Astronomy, who's done a great job of looking at a large sample of supernovae and looking at what is the dependence of their infrared brightness with the properties of the galaxy. So this is a paper that we're writing together, and what we find currently is that there's a very minimal dependence on the properties of the galaxy that makes them like a very nice sort of standard candle, which is a sort of comparison to where in the optical they are standard-ish candles, and therefore we can try to use them in the distant universe as well without needing as much information about their galaxies in order to measure both the properties of the present-day expansion rate and to understand dark energy using the infrared light from the Type 1a supernovae. So Tyson Chan has been doing some really cool work for the last few weeks, and a lot of his stuff is also out publicly, like through code repositories and stuff. So if people are interested in this, it's something I'm very keen to talk about. So for the last part, I'll basically be talking about something where supernovae are interesting and like they are a very new approach in order to measure the expansion rate of the universe. And this is the sort of phenomenon of gravitational lensing. So similar to like optical lenses, this magnifies the light from a background source, and it's been a prediction of Einstein's gravity because it treats gravity as a geometry. So at the shortest shortest distance between 2 points in a space, you see that this bends the light from a background source if you have a very massive source between you and what you are observing. So it could be a galaxy, it could be just the active nucleus of a galaxy, or as has been proposed, it could be a supernova. So this was also the first experimental test of the theory of Einstein's theory of gravity. So while it's not the deflection of light through such sources has been like sort of even seen in like Newton's optics in 1704, or also through like von Sollner's treatise in 1804, the prediction of the deflection matched what was observed. So the prediction of the deflection from Einstein's gravity was what matched what was observed by the eclipse. And while people back then were not very optimistic about the use of gravitational lensing for astronomy and cosmology, that was because they were thinking of the deflector being a star or a constellation of stars, whereas what was shown like in Fritz Zwicky's 1937 paper was that clusters of galaxies or galaxies can be very typical lenses, and that would really magnify the light from a background object and allow us to study these objects really well. But why is it that the lensing of supernovae particularly is important? And this is just like probably I hope the only equation that I have put apart from the Hubble law here, which is essentially showing how we can measure the expansion rate using the phenomenon of gravitational lensing. So while it was first proposed that this would be a great method by a Norwegian astronomer Sjur Refsdal in 1964, the first such lensed supernova was only really found in 2015. And this is particularly important because here you see that for certain configurations where you have a favorable sort of intervening deflector such that you can end up getting multiple images of your background source, there we can then use the difference in the arrival time of these different images in order to measure the value of the expansion rate of the universe, this value or this quantity h0. And using the delay time from the different images of the supernova is something that was originally proposed, but there wasn't really an observation of any such event, whether it is a supernova or any other event that is a transient or flickers with time. Till 1979, when this was seen for the active galactic nucleus of an event called Q0957. And that's sort of what started a second revolution in lensing. And lensed quasars, which are these active parts of of galaxies were used quite a lot to measure the value of the expansion rate. Lens supernovae are really cool because here they can be found just by looking at how magnified they are. And when we have a system wherein we can model the galaxy, this gives us a very precise estimate of the value of the expansion rate. So this first event was named Supernova Refstal in honor of Shure Refstal, and it was lensed by a cluster of galaxies. So we saw many images, but this cluster was very difficult to model. Ideally, the kinds of events are like the ones where we saw the first strongly lensed type 1e supernova, where it was found in the precursor survey to what we're currently working on. So we're currently working on this Zwicky Transient Facility, and it was found in the Palomar Transient Factory, which is the precursor to this survey. And by then discovering it in that survey and observing it with the Hubble Space Telescope, we could see the multiple images. And from these multiple images, we could then derive a delay time. And these are the kinds of systems that would be quite interesting when in future surveys, as well as ongoing surveys, we have an independent constraint on how fast the universe is expanding. This is also important because using the magnification of the supernovae, we can start to explore theories of gravity beyond Einstein's GR as well, and also have constraints on the fraction of dark matter that comes from a primordial black hole. There's also lots of different things that can be done that are really cool with these lens supernova systems, even beyond the expansion rate. And I have a shameless self-plug here for an article that I wrote about gravitational lensing that was sort of putting together both the historical context and like what we're doing currently. It's in a news website called The Wire in India. I really enjoyed writing for them, and it's been like a great learning experience for me to write popular science articles. So I just feel that if anyone could benefit or enjoy from reading that, I just wanted to put that link down there. So what are we doing right now? And this is sort of the last part of me talking. What we're doing right now is we're basically taking the data from surveys that are scanning large areas of the sky. And we really need large areas of the sky for things like lens supernovae because they're extremely rare. Like we see supernovae, we can commonly see lots of supernovae and observe them in great detail. But these lensing events happen very rarely. So what we then need is to scan large parts of the sky quite quickly. And this is something the Zwicky Transient Facility we're currently working on. It is named after Fritz Zwicky. It has a very large sort of field of view, which can view large parts of the sky. And it scans the entire northern sky. So it's in Palomar Observatory. So it's sensitive to observing the northern sky. And we can see in comparison to other surveys that have existed and are ongoing, it has a much larger field of view. Of course, some of these surveys, they go much deeper in to see the universe when it was even younger. But like, for example, the Vera Rubin Observatory's legacy survey of space and time will be looking much deeper into when the universe was younger. But ZTF has a much wider coverage, so it can scan larger areas much more quickly. So it's sort of like a test bed for future surveys. And what we need is sort of to classify these events really quickly. So this has been sort of one of our bottlenecks that we're kind of getting over. And I have observing programs with like our team where we're looking at doing these classifications very promptly with bigger telescopes. So the thing with the Discovery telescope here is it's a 1.2 meter, whereas these are bigger. So this is around the 2.5 meter in La Palma. And this is an 8-meter telescope, the Gemini telescope in Mauna Kea. And these are extremely important because when you see something that's faint and red, it could be a lens supernova, it could be a lot of other things, which would by themselves be interesting, but not for the same reasons as a lens supernova. So we really need to know what it is beyond just that it is interesting, and that's what we need these bigger telescopes for. So that's what this Zwicky Transient Facility is really cool about, is this having the access to discover such events like in like a reasonable time frame, and we can possibly see that this is the kind of machinery that would help us understand how to discover these better and have a greater efficiency even with future surveys. But also it has discovered thousands of supernovae. So around the first phase of observations, which ended towards the fall of last year and transitioned into the second phase, which is even faster in scanning the sky in its public survey. There have been around 5,000 supernovae that have been classified. Now, in comparison, samples which were discovering accelerated expansion were few tens of supernovae. Samples that were like in the distance ladder were a couple of hundred of supernovae. So here we're going to start to see like thousands of supernovae with a single discovery machine. And once we have a well-characterized sample of these supernovae, we can start to study properties like the expansion rate, but also start to see how clumpy the universe is using supernovae, which was something that would have been near unheard of in the past few years to decades. So this is something that is like a really cool thing about ZTF, is that it's finding all these supernovae, which would be really cool for studying the structure in the nearby universe, but also for finding exotic transients like the lens supernova, and that's something I'm working on currently. So just the last thing before I stop talking is there's a lot of really cool stuff that can be done in the future. So the James Webb Space Telescope, which has a scheduled launch date in December this year, will be really cool for pushing the distance ladder out to an even larger distance, so that we can then start to measure these either Cepheid variable or other distance, like using other stars as distance indicators, with lots more galaxies that have supernovae. So the thing is that in the nearby universe, we just don't have that many galaxies, which is never a problem that I thought we would have to encounter, but that's just like how the universe is. And that's a really cool thing, that we've sort of exhausted how many galaxies there are we can measure distances to. And with James Webb Space Telescope, we can push it further. The Rubin Observatory, amongst lots of other things, will be a really cool discovery machine for lens supernovae, because it goes even deeper and like is expected to find hundreds of such systems. And we're currently trying to see how can we start to distinguish those that are lens supernovae from those that are not but look like lens supernovae, and doing that with current surveys. And we'd be able to learn so much more with like the next generation of dark energy experiments like the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. That will be sort of online towards the end of this decade. So it's a really sort of cool future in terms of doing cosmology with supernova. And with that, I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Well, that was a great talk, Suhail. Thank you so much for it. It's great to see people all enthusiastic about the research they do, and you really brought that across. So that's great, even if I have to admit I didn't quite understand every detail of it. But thank you very much, and I'm sure our audience says a big thank you as well. As promised, I would relay a couple of questions to you. We are very close to 7 o'clock, so we may not have that much time. So maybe, Suhail, I can suggest that while I read out the first question to you, you pull up the slide that has your email address, and then if people have more questions later on, they can send you an email, if that's all right with you. So the first question is from David Purchase, who asks, how can we discount the possibility that the properties of supernovae, for example, were different in very distant galaxies, which by definition were much earlier in the age of the universe?
Yep, that's a great question. And that was some of the things that were discussed as potentially being a simpler explanation of this observed dimming. So there were some earlier studies where people say maybe it is that the dust in higher redshift galaxies is what's dimming these. But what would have been is that if you then look at supernovae that are twice as far, you expect twice the amount of dimming, and that was not sort of seen. It was very consistent with what was the cosmological model that had the accelerated expansion instead of a model with like increased dust properties of the galaxy. But also it could be that the supernovae were different. So that's what people did, where in one case, it looked at these supernovae at, say, much earlier time in the evolution of the universe, which is where sort of the data for inferring dark energy properties came from. And looking at them, say, looking at their spectra, comparing it to what we see in the nearby universe, they look nearly identical. So having these kind of comparisons with both their brightness evolution, as well as like having a comparison with their spectra, is something that was one of the ways in which we could sort of justify that this is actually an effect that is cosmological and not because of the supernovae being different. Mm-hmm. The difference in sort of properties based on their galaxies is something that is still a sort of thorn in the side of people trying to infer properties of dark energy quite precisely. That's something that is being investigated a lot as to like what are the dependencies and to what degree do they affect our cosmological inference. It's not at a degree that sort of washes out any signal for accelerated expansion, but it is something that would be an important thing for distinguishing what are the different possibilities explaining the accelerated expansion. And that's something that would be important. Do we actually see something that's like the cosmological constant, or do we see something that's different from it? For that, we really need to understand like what is the dependence on the host galaxy properties. So at the level of precision we're looking at, this is an important question that is still open, but there has been lots of like observations to show that they are similar in the nearby and distant universe.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask David if he can at all to just say that he's satisfied with this answer. Could be in the chat or otherwise maybe just unmute and say, yep, satisfied. But meanwhile, I think I'll read out one more question that's there, Suhail.
Happy.
Hello, David. You're happy with the answer?
Perfectly happy, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you for letting us know. Okay, so the next question is by Manya, and it sounds to me like a very technical question, this one. How is the inclination of the merger correlated to the distance?
So that's a great question. It's sort of one of the reasons why we want to look into this is that, so when you have a merger with some distance and some inclination, you see a form of the gravitational wave. And the thing is that this form looks kind of the same if you have an event that is sort of closer to us, but we only see it through its edge. But if it's an event that is farther away, but we see it like face on, so what you see is that the observation is essentially the waveform, and the loudness of this waveform is kind of the same if you have something that is like you're seeing it face on, but you're seeing it farther away, or you're seeing it in a different inclination closer to the edge. But you're seeing it closer to you. So it's kind of, so it's to put it in terms of like, say in terms of light, it would be like saying if you have something that is fainter but closer to you, it would appear the same brightness as if something was intrinsically brighter but farther away. So it's sort of that trade-off that means that like when we observe a particular waveform, we're not fully able to deconstruct whether it is coming because it is farther away or because of a different inclination. So that's what we mean by this correlation in the distance and the inclination. I hope that explained it to some degree.
Okay, I'm just going to ask Manya if they can give us any sign that, yes, this is a satisfying explanation. Thank you. Yeah, okay, great. We had some other questions, Suhail, but a lot less technical. One being, where did you get this nice coffee? From our bursar, Leslie Thompson. But I think you could maybe give her that information personally next time you see her. So I think because we are past 7 o'clock, unfortunately, we have to close this session. But I'm going to say once again, a big thank you from all of us for a very lovely talk about these candles in the sky. And I hope you'll come back to Live from Lucy another time, either to talk about candles in the sky again, or maybe to try out your stand-up comics, because that'd be great as well. And otherwise, I just wanted to say also thank you to everyone in the audience for participating and being present, because there's nothing greater for our speakers as to have a nice, large, interested audience. So thank you very much from all of us at Lucy Cavendish, and hope to see you next time. And thanks again, Suhail.
Thank you for having me. This was great.